The cursor.
Where's the cursor?
Right in his hair.
Oh,
There you go.
okay. Ricky, we're good. We're ready for you to start.
Okay, well, good morning to all, and as always, thank you for this privilege to teach. Mark, thank you for bringing up those two important points in your prayer about the homeless or those who may not be able to afford electricity or any type of heat. That's a world that none of us probably know anything about personally. But it is a serious problem. And then with the fires in California, the more I read about that, that's just beyond imagination. The incredible mass of destruction of property and lives, and so sad. So we need to remember them and ask God how we can help, how we can do our part to help with that. So I need to offer this disclaimer to start. Sean's got a cat right behind him. Max appears, if you watch Sean's in his Hollywood Square there, you'll see Max the cat. So if I'm suddenly distracted and forget everything, there's Max in the lower corner. Y'all know how I love animals, so if I go blank for a second, you know what happened. Max did something that caught my attention. Okay, we are beginning chapter 15. We have been in the book of Mark for a long time, haven't we? But it's going to wrap up really quickly. Chapter 15, chapter 16 is very short. So let's give some background now. Remember that Jesus has been betrayed by Judas. He has been arrested by the Sanhedrin and their soldiers. They had a small army, kind of like the Vatican does, and they have arrested Jesus at night, secretly, to avoid people reacting and having to control a mob. We're going to see as we go through chapter 15 that everything the Sanhedrin does is secretly, illegally, and corrupt. And all of Jesus's disciples have fled. Even though we want to remember that there was a time when Peter cut off the ear of the servant named Malchus, Jesus restored it. The other disciples said, "Shall we too strike with the sword?" We forget that those disciples, as I said last week, they were packing. They were ready for a fight. You have to imagine they were well outnumbered, but they were willing to die. And then when Jesus said, "No, put it away. That's not the way I do things." It must have overwhelmed them. They didn't know what to do next other than just run for their lives. And we also know that John Mark, later called Mark, who wrote this gospel for Peter, was present. And now so Jesus is under house arrest. We're going to pick up the story in verses 1 and 2. He's already gone through the trial. The trial was held in an illegal place, so it could be secret. It was held at night, which was illegal, so it could be secret. Imagine the Supreme Court saying, "We got to figure out how to put this ruling together. It's going to be very provocative. We've got to do it in secret. We can't meet where the Supreme Court normally meets. Let's meet at one of the houses of the Supreme Court Justice. Let's do it at night. Let's all arrive separately under the cover of darkness. And so nobody will know. We'll put this together and then we'll go public with it tomorrow. And maybe we can do this." Again, the whole trial system that Jesus goes through start to finish, is illegal and corrupt. Just a mockery of the system, totally unjust to him. So now the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, um, they're going to continue what they've been doing. We pick up the story now, verses 1 and 2. Very early in the morning, let me stop right there. After the trial, Jesus is placed in a dungeon. Historians they're pretty confident they know where that dungeon is at. And there's a church built on top of it. It's in Jerusalem, of course. Some of you may have been there. There's this kind of a spiral staircase that takes you down fairly close to it. And you can look down into that. It's just a hole in the ground. And it's dark and it's dreary and it's damp. And Jesus, you can just imagine him deserted, all alone. He knows what's coming. He knows the prophecies. He knows by his prayers at Gethsemane that God's not going to take away what's coming, that he's going to have to go through it. You ever been in a situation, you don't have to raise your hand or say anything, when you prayed, you begged God, help me. I don't want to go through this. Please, please. And God doesn't answer your prayer. You have to go through it. It's no fun. It's part of what we talked about last week when Hebrews talks about how Jesus learned obedience by reading his Bible. No. Going to the synagogue a lot. No. Serving people faithfully. No. By suffering. And so we want to be like Jesus. We want to walk in his footsteps, right? All right, let's see. I'm going to ask the class to line up for suffering. Who wants to go first? No, none of us want to go through suffering. And I remember once having a long time ago, maybe I was still in high school, a preacher preached on this. And afterwards, this young girl, a new convert, came up to him and said, I want this. I want to learn obedience through suffering. Where can you send me so I can begin to suffer? Because she was just so new. And I remember he said, as a crowd gathered around him, he said, honey, it's going to come. Life's going to bring it your way. Don't go looking for it. You're going to get enough just experiencing life. So Jesus now is in that dungeon. And the Sanhedrin met to discuss their next step. Now, we want to remember that they want Jesus dead. That requires capital punishment. The Romans say only we can do capital punishment. So the Sanhedrin functions basically like a grand jury. They have to compile evidence and bring it to Pilate and say, look, this is enough evidence to make it worthy of you executing Jesus. And they think they have done that. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and took him to Pilate. Pilate had been appointed by the Roman government to be governor of Judea. You remember there were different regions of Palestine. There was Samaria, there was Galilee. Herod was over Galilee. There was Judea. Jerusalem was in Judea. Pilate was over Judea. It was the largest one as far as population and value to the Romans. They led him away and took him to Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, to be king of the Jews meant to the Jews that Jesus was trying to be God. Now, it meant to the Romans, you're a revolutionary. You're wanting to overthrow Caesar and the Roman system. So Pilate asked them, is this true? They're saying that you call yourself a king. And Jesus' reply was very interesting. And he said, you have said it. And so as we go through this, we're going to see his unusual response. Picture yourself, if you're Jesus, you know that you're looking at the man called Pilate, who with just one sentence can sentence you to capital punishment, and you're dead. Your life is over. And yet Jesus doesn't try to defend himself. Let me read the rest of it here. Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Luke 23 tells us that the charge the Sanhedrin brought was different than what they had condemned him for, which was claiming to be the Messiah. Luke says they actually charged him with forbidding the people to give tribute to Caesar. Remember, once a year they had this big ceremony. You had to show up. You had to offer a pinch of salt and maybe a monetary tribute. If you would do that, basically the Romans said you can do anything else the rest of the year, but you got to show up for this, and they recorded everyone's name. But that Jesus had never said that or done that. So this is one more of the trumped up charges. It shows that the Sanhedrin, and again, I can only refer them to our Supreme Court. Imagine our non-Supreme Court justices being this unjust, unfair. It would be shocking, to say the least. Verses 3-5. Now, I want you to, I talk often about how Mark would make a great movie. You got to picture this scene. Pilate is sitting in his chair of authority, like a king would sit, and before him is Jesus. And he's exhausted. He's worn out. He probably hasn't slept in about 36 hours now. He's fatigued. Behind him are the Sanhedrin, and they're just hurling insults at him. The leading priests kept accusing him of many crimes. It's like they're just making up things as fast as they can think of them, just to overwhelm Pilate, just to say, oh, this guy's not just bad, he is really bad. He's just done everything. You got to get rid of him. And Pilate, he's watching Jesus. He's listening to all these accusations, and Jesus is not saying anything. He's used to people, debating, fighting for their lives, begging for mercy. And Pilate finally says to Jesus, aren't you going to answer them? Aren't you going to defend yourself? Aren't you going to do anything? What about all these charges they are bringing against you? Are you even listening? But Jesus said nothing. So my first question to the class and to Zoom this morning, and remember, there's no right or wrong answers. I always learn by what you say. So why did Jesus just say nothing?
I think I think the primary reason is he knew what the plan was. Okay, so if he defended himself, then God's plan went awry.
Okay, Fred, that's a good answer. That makes perfect sense. Anyone else?
Cheryl, to me, it's like grace under fire. If he argued, what would come from that? Just more clamor and heat. If he didn't, there was, to me, it's just grace under fire. That's the best word I have for it. What good would come from arguing?
Okay, great answer, great thought. Thank you. Someone else.
He's surrendering to God's will.
Yes. Yes, that's very obvious.
Maybe,
Philip?
maybe he knew they couldn't hear.
Yeah, that it wouldn't even make a difference to say anything. That's entirely possible. I think we've all been in situations when you wanted to say something to help someone, a child, a friend, and you know good and well their minds are closed. Don't confuse me with the facts. And you know, there's a great old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will come, which means basically the teacher's been there all along, but the student just wasn't ready. But and so the student's mind was closed, and it's obvious in this situation that the Sanhedrin, their mind's made up. They want this guy dead. They want him gone. He is threatening their livelihood, their pocketbook, the entire religious system that Israel is built on. And remember, if I've taught you anything about Mark, please remember this. Over and over and over again, Jesus tells the people, you have not correctly understood God. It's not that you have it all wrong, but you have not totally and correctly understood God. Time and time again, Jesus said, well, you know, the prophets said thus and thus, but I say, time and time again, Jesus interpreted Old Testament scripture differently than others had done. So it's a reminder to us that we're no different from these people in the Bible. You know, it's so easy to say, oh, I would have never done that. I would have never denied Jesus. I would have been a faithful disciple. I would have understood clearly. Well, no, we wouldn't have been any different than they are. And so there's still something in us today that struggles with that. I'm just going to throw it out there because I can say I'm at the top of the list. We do not correctly understand God. There's something in all of us that has a slight misunderstanding of God because we're not perfect. We're not God. And so we need to spend the rest of our lives asking the Holy Spirit, open our spiritual eyes. Help us to see where we misunderstand. Help us have the courage to make the change, knowing that when we make the change, there's going to be people in our lives that go, oh, I don't know about that. I don't see it that way. Ricky's losing it. He's slipping away from orthodox belief, and most people, they interpret orthodox belief as what they believe personally. So anyway, that's your first free sermon this morning. Sorry about that. Where was I? But Jesus said nothing. So, was there anyone else that wanted to make a statement as to why you think Jesus said nothing? Bill?
Kind of going along with what Fred and Judy were referring to, it seems to me that when Jesus told the Father, I don't want this to happen because it's going to be bad, but more than that, I want whatever you want. And I think it was in Jesus' nature to just be quiet, to not say, oh, I need to defend myself because this isn't good. Jesus knew this was good. This was why it's called the good news. His death and suffering for us. As much as we hate it, it was God's will somehow. It was what God wanted to happen, that needed to happen. And who is he, a human Jesus? Who is he to say, wait a minute, I think it's basically saying to all of us, when the bad things come and we've already done all our praying and talking, sometimes it's good just to shut up and say, God's will is being done. I'm just going to trust him.
Thank you, Bill. That's very profound. That is the truth. Okay, let me go on. Verses 6 through 11. Now it was the governor's custom each year during the Passover celebration to release one prisoner. Now just picture that. Imagine if one day every year the President of the United States said, I am going to release one person off death row. Can you imagine the race to get to the president? Can you imagine people who are trying to get on TV and talk shows and podcasts, how social media is going to be bombarded? I mean, so there must have been a lot of people there who said, that's my son, my grandson is going to die. A lot of jockeying for position of power and influence. This must have been a powerful, powerful moment that people thought about all year round. Now it was the governor's custom each year during the Passover celebration to release one prisoner. Anyone the people requested. That's pretty crazy. Anyone, no matter what they've done, that was the custom. One of the prisoners at that time was Barabbas. We've all heard Barabbas in this one. There is no historical evidence of Barabbas. That does not mean I think he did not exist. But we can't learn anything about Barabbas from history, like Josephus or other historical writers. We have to get all we know from the gospel accounts. And that was basically that he was a revolutionary. He wanted to overthrow the Roman government. He could also be known as a zealot. Remember one of Jesus's disciples, forget his name at the moment, he was a zealot. He was one of those who walked around with the very short dagger, who could sneak up to someone in a crowd, try to stab them in the kidney or the liver, an organ where it'd be fateful, a quick stab, be lost in the crowd. And Barabbas is also a murderer. Yeah, why would you want to release this person back into public? But anyway, the crowd went to Pilate and asked him to release a prisoner as usual. And Pilate, thinking, okay, this will be easy. You know, he's looking at Barabbas. He'd like to already have Barabbas executed. He's looking at Jesus and he's thinking, what has this guy done wrong? I've been hearing stories about him. All he's been doing is teaching in the temple area. He's heard the stories about the miracles of him feeding people. He's never tried to overthrow the government. It's all nonviolent. He's no threat to me. He's no threat to Caesar. I've never had to report him higher up on the chain of command. So he's thinking, this will be easy. And so he says, would you like me to release to you this king of the Jews? Thinking, this is a gimme. This is a slam dunk. For he realized by then the leading priest stirred up the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus. And so he's probably thinking that the crowd can see through this. But we're going to see what happened. But as we get there, we need to remember that Pilate did not need their permission. Even if they wanted Barabbas and he had to let Barabbas go, he still had the authority to say, I'm going to release Jesus. There's just not enough evidence. Sanhedrin, these are just trumped up charges. Him asking the crowd was basically, that was a legal loophole. He was kind of hoping to not have to take responsibility for it. Pilate asked him, verses 12 through 14, then what should I do with this man you call king of the Jews? Because the crowd again has already said, give us Barabbas. They shouted back, crucify him. Capital punishment. That's the same thing as saying, kill the guy. Just kill him. Get him out of our society. Why? Pilate demanded. What crime has he committed? Never hurt anybody. He's not a revolutionary. He's no threat to this Roman way of life, this Roman culture. Why? What is going on? You know, in counseling, sometimes you have to tell yourself the issue is not the issue. And so Pilate's got to be thinking that. What crime has he committed? See, he still doesn't believe the Sanhedrin. He still thinks that all they've got is trumped up charges. But the mob roared back even louder, crucify him, crucify him, kill the son of a gun. So Pilate here, just like we talked about Peter and denying Jesus, a picture of someone who's overconfident in their spiritual maturity or their spirituality, in their commitment to God, in their personal strength. Pilate is a picture of a person who evades responsibility. He has the power, he has the authority, but he will not do what is right. Not to try not to meddle in politics, but to me, this is a perfect picture of many politicians today who have the authority, who have the power to stand up for what is right, and yet they're more concerned about being reelected and hanging on to their power. So they evade responsibility. It's a cowardice act. That's what Pilate did. Now, I don't want to pick on politicians because we can all do that ourselves. But I see that a lot in the world. Verse 15. So to pacify the crowd, there he goes, Pilate. You know, he will not take a stand. He will not say yes or no. He just to pacify the crowd. Oh, no, I want out of this. Let's get this over with. Pilate released Barabbas to them. Now, that's got to be hard for Pilate, thinking, man, I just gave back one of the enemies. I just released someone. And then he ordered Jesus, and I got to stop right here because this would be an important scene in the movie. If you've seen Mel Gibson's The Passion, it is, in my opinion, the most realistic in the description of when we refer to the passion of Jesus. That's the suffering he went through these last few hours up to the crucifixion. Now we're going to talk about the flogging. You probably are all familiar with it. I'm going to read a quote that comes from a historical account, not written with any spiritual or biblical influence over it, just a straightforward, objective description of it. The Romans, let's see, let's go back. I was going to read something. I guess I have to go forward to pick that up. The Romans first stripped the victim and tied his hands to a post above his head. Can you picture that? Someone's tied like this. They can't move. And by the way, it was never allowed to flog a child or a woman because 99% of the time they die. So you don't want this person to die, but you want to beat them within an inch of their life. Because a lot of times that's all that was ordered was the flogging, and then the crucifixion was not included. The Romans first stripped the victim and tied his hands to a post above his head. Now, the whip was made of several strips of leather, not just one, like you see in the Westerns where a cowboy has a long whip and he'll hit somebody. But sometimes they're referred to as a cat o' nine tails. They had more than 9 strips. Each strip had pieces of bone and lead embedded near the ends. The bones would cut the flesh. The lead would break and chip bones, vertebrae, and rupture disc. Flogging was limited to 40 strikes. That's because they'd learned you go much more over 40, you're going to kill them. We don't want to kill them. We just want to beat them within an inch of their life for a public demonstration and to be a deterrent to them. It was limited to 40 strikes, and the one giving the strikes could be flogged for giving more. So the number was usually limited to 39. If I'm the flogger, I'm not going over 40. So I'm going to be safe. I'm going to stop at 30, 39. At first, the heavy thongs cut through the skin only. Then as the blows continued, they'd cut deeper, producing blood first from the capillaries and veins, and then spurting arterial bleeding from the vessels and the underlying muscles. Think of the pain. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, shredded, bleeding tissue. It is not surprising that many victims of Roman floggings did not survive. Now, if you can picture that, Jesus is still going to be looking like that when he dies on the cross. Imagine the blood that you would lose. Imagine the body fluid you would lose. Imagine the shock that your body would go into. And this is just the beginning. Now, next, and remember the Gospel of Mark leaves out a lot of details. Matthew and Luke are really much better with the details. Mark, is short and succinct and right to the point. And so now we jump to another scene in the movie. It's where Jesus is handed over to a group of soldiers. And it seems to imply that these soldiers, part of their responsibility was this crucifixion, this capital punishment. And I'll point out some things as we go through that shows they knew specific things to do. Verses 16 through 20, the soldiers took Jesus. So now this tells us from history that this scene unfolds while something else is taking place. The Romans had a strict ritual for crucifixion. It began by a commanding officer of that regiment stating, pronouncing, declaring, the sentence is that this man should be taken to a cross. In other words, crucified until dead. Then he would look around the group and he would point out and choose a soldier and say, go, soldier, and prepare the cross. So it is during this time of preparation of securing and preparing the cross that the soldiers began to mock Jesus. Now, what we're going to see in the mocking is not good. It's physical abuse. And Jesus has already gone through the flogging. I just can't imagine how he would be able to stand. Then it says, they dressed him in a purple robe. Kings always wore purple. Purple was the most expensive dye. It was a sign, or it could only be afforded by royalty. So purple was a color fit for a king. They dressed him in a purple robe, and they wove thorn branches. Now, there are a couple of plants that grow in Israel, and I've been fortunate to actually see them and just lightly touch the end of those thorns. They can grow up to be 2 or 3 inches long. And they were, in this instance, woven together to look like a crown. Then they saluted him. Oh, they put it on his head and taunted him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Like, if you're a king, you're a joke. You got no army. You have no followers. You have no power, no authority. You're about as much a king as I am. And then they struck him on the head with a reed stick. Okay, blows to the head continually. It could have caused concussion. And those thorns, even though they were long, they're flexible. I've done it. You can take them and move them back and forth. That means it's entirely possible that as they were pounded down upon his head, they would go in, hit the cranium, and curve back out like a fishhook. Now keep that in mind. That crown is hooked to his head. Then they spit on him. Okay. Now they're all Gentiles. They hate Jews, and the Jews hate the Gentiles. I mean, it is racism at its worst. And when they're in uniform, they can't be spitting on the Jews. So this is their big opportunity. They got a Jew. Imagine you're a white supremacist and you've got a black person before you. And this is your big opportunity. You hate black people. And so you want to do everything you can to take your hatred out on this one black person that represents everything you help. And they struck him on the head with a reed, spit on him, dropped to their knees and mock worship. Remember, Jesus is bound up, I'm sure. When they finally tired, that means they went on for a long time. Taking turns, a lot of men. They took off the purple robe. Oh, by now it has dried and stuck to those ribbons, strips of shredded tissue. The blood has begun to coagulate and dry. And when they rip that robe off, everything is torn loose again. The blood begins to flow. And they put his own clothes on him again, and they led him away to be crucified. All that flogging, all that beating, all that he's gone through, the injustice of a trial. It's just, if something like this happened today, there'd be a long line of people who would be convicted and go into prison for a different amount of years. Now, again, because the Gospel of Peter is so short and so succinct, we just jump from scene to scene to scene. The other gospels kind of flow along, filling in details. Now we're going to just jump straight from the crucifixion. Remember, Jesus has to carry his cross along a path that's come to be known as the Via Dolorosa. If you ever been to Jerusalem, you know where that is. I hope they told you that no one knows for sure where it was at, and that path has been changed several times over the centuries. But that's okay, because the point is you're following, you're walking a path that symbolizes what Jesus walked. It's like when you go to Israel and you go to a church that is supposedly built where Jesus taught the Beatitudes. Well, nobody knows for sure that's the spot, but it's pretty close. It's like when you go to the Jordan River to be baptized. There's two primary places to be baptized. Um, I've been baptized in both. I've baptized dozens of people in both. And what I tell them is that nobody knows for sure which one it is. But the point is, you're in the Jordan River. You're in the very river where Jesus was baptized. That's the point. That's what you hold on to. That's what makes it valid. So when you walk that Via Dolorosa, it's a matter of principle. You picture Jesus flogged within an inch of his life, mocked, beaten, and believe me, that cross was a piece of heavy wood. Some historians think it was shaped in a T. Some think that T had a top to it. Some people think that Jesus only had to haul the long, tall piece, and another soldier would carry the crossbar. So nobody knows for sure, but I'm telling you, it must have been extremely difficult. And they must have thought, oh my gosh, he is never going to get there. You have to be crucified outside the city limits, outside the city walls. And there is a specific area where they go. And everyone in town knows that's where these capital punishments take place. And so we're going to see people would rush out there to see what's going on, who's done what, and who's going to die. And along the way of this Via Dolorosa, a passerby named Simon, who was from Cyrene. Now, Cyrene we don't know exactly where it is, but it was probably a town in modern day Libya. And that's a long way to come. But every Jew wanted to come to Jerusalem at least one time in their life to celebrate the Passover. In movies and in books, you've heard the phrase the Jewish people use a lot. Next year in Jerusalem, everybody wants to go there. The Muslim wants to go to Mecca. Other religions have different places. For the Jew, it was Jerusalem. And so Simon, probably at great expense and a lot of time, he's got to walk, unless he had a horse or donkey, and the great amount of people didn't. So he's come all this way. He's so excited to be there. He's so excited to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. This has been a goal, a dream of his life. It's a highlight of his life. And then all of a sudden, here come the Romans. And believe me, when the Roman soldiers came through, people scattered, because the Roman soldiers were looking for any excuse to whack somebody with a sword, either with it flat and it'd be like a blow or a cut. And people got out of their way. And here comes someone who's hauling a cross. Oh my gosh. He's going to the electric chair. What has this person done? And you can be sure a big crowd was around. And the soldiers must have been thinking, oh man, we're never going to get there. This is going to take all day. I want to go home for supper, whatever they're thinking. And so they stop and they think to themselves, we got to find somebody to carry this cross for Jesus. Now, I have a hunch, this is pure speculation. You can do with it what you want, but I bet they looked around the crowd for someone big and strong, and their eyes met Simon. Now, the Romans had a rule that they could constrict you. Is that the right word? Constrict. Demand that you go and be obedient to him. All they had to do was take their sword, turn it flat where it wouldn't cut, and tap you on the shoulder. In other words, you're commissioned to do this duty. And they look at Simon, this probably big, tall, strong guy, and say, got a job for you. And he knows he can't say no, or he's going to pay a physical price for the rest of his life. And the soldiers forced him. You know, they didn't look across the crowd and say, oh, behold this poor guy and Jesus. He's so tired. He's so exhausted. Would anyone volunteer to help? Anyone willing to help? I'll take any volunteer. No. They forced Simon to carry Jesus's cross. He's come to Passover to celebrate, highlight of his life. And now suddenly this. So my question for you, and again, there's no right or wrong answers. I just love your answers. What do you think Simon was thinking? What was he feeling? What do you think was going through his mind when basically the Romans grabbed him by the collar and drug him out? What do you think?
That he was petrified.
Good point.
Yeah, it's just like, how far along this process are they gonna want me to go?
Mm-hmm.
Crucified on the cross with this man.
Charlie, that's a really good point. I never thought of that one. That he was terrified. If he didn't get this right, they might just chop off a foot or a hand. And, so he would be a public demonstration of failure to do what the Romans wanted. Someone else. What do you think Simon was thinking?
I think it would depend greatly on if he knew whose cross he was carrying. If he came in from the country, does he really know that it's Jesus? If not, he could think it's another criminal and he's just being asked to do this task.
Yeah, Fred, that's a good point. We're going to see that the Roman custom was there was always 4 soldiers, and one of the 4 soldiers had to walk in front of Jesus with a sign that would eventually be placed on top of the cross. And Jesus' sign said, King of the Jews. So that immediately would, if you're Jewish, that would make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Oh my gosh, this guy was a revolutionary. He thinks he's king instead of Caesar, or he may really be nuts, and he thinks he's the Messiah. Ooh, Simon was probably backing up, but before they tapped him on the shoulder. Bill?
I want to give a different script writing of that movie you're talking about. It's more than likely, like you said, and like Fred said, he's from out there. He didn't even know who Jesus was. He just got pulled into the picture. But it's altogether possible that Simon was this big old guy who had heard about Jesus like most everybody had heard about what he'd done, heard about his miracles. He was actually a follower of Jesus. There's always the possibility. I want to think that maybe Simon was the kind of guy that said what my best friend said when he was suffering before he died. And somebody said, "Are you still a Christian?" He said, "Am I better than my master?" I like to think that Simon said, that man never did anything wrong. And look at all the stuff I've done. I'm glad to carry my master's cross. And he was happy to be the servant of Jesus. I think it says to me, no matter how bad things got, everything that you said and even more, Ricky, Jesus never said, "Father, enough is enough. I can't take it anymore." Because I've seen a lot of folks at that point who say, "Enough's enough. I can't take it anymore." But I'm grateful for those who can say, "Father, I'm not greater than my master Jesus, and he's been through so much more than I am. I can take it. I'm going to take it." And the Lord takes care of us all the way through.
Oh my gosh, Bill, that's a great devotional or sermon. That's very moving. Thank you. Thank you. There is something about when we carry that cross, something we didn't ask for, but something that God asked us to take responsibility for. And we carry it to completion. There's something about that that's like Jesus. It may be hard as Hades, but if we do it, it's pleasing to the Father. It makes us more like Jesus. And it's a good witness. Wow. I'm tempted to end on that. That's
Can I ask something? Isn't Simon the one that comes back later and wants to help take Jesus to the tomb? Isn't he the one that wants to help do that? Doesn't he go back to, not Pilate, but after the crucifixion, isn't he the one that petitions to be allowed to take Jesus and put him in the tomb?
I think you may be thinking of Joseph of Arimathea.
Okay, sorry, you're right, sorry.
Yeah. And we will get to that. So hang on to that because Joseph of Arimathea does play a very, very important point. Well, Bill, as always, you are so profound and so moving that I cannot improve on that. So I'm calling it quits. And I'm making a point now. I got through verses 21 and 22, right?
I got a question for you, Ricky.
Oh, gee. Okay.
And anybody else. Is it altogether possible that this fella who went out and picked up the cross did, in fact, do it because he was a quiet, in the background Christian who stepped forward to help his Lord? Is that even possible?
Well, I'm going to talk about that in the next few verses. So I think that's a good question for the class to be thinking about. Read the passage. I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to go back to the beginning of verses 21 and 22 and go forward. But Bill, that is an excellent question. So I'm going to weave that in very, very early. At probably the beginning of verse 21. So be ready, be thinking. So Bill, thank you very much. Okay, Les, that wraps it up.